Welcome back to another one of your flip lectures. In today's flip lecture, we're going to discuss the Great Depression. And the Great Depression began in the late 1920s under President Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover was a politician who believed in limited government, meaning that he did not believe that the government should play an active role in the economy or in the lives of citizens. And as a result of his inaction, many people are going to blame Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression. However, Hoover did try a few things, but his policies actually made the Great Depression worse. He raised tariffs, taxes on trade, and this led to fewer countries trading with the United States, which meant less business for American businesses. He also raised interest rates, which caused deflation. And, as you know from our economics unit, deflation carries with it many consequences that would make it hard for people during the Great Depression. All this resulted in the Depression getting much worse after 1929. And the Great Depression wasn't just in the United States. It was a worldwide economic crisis that affected Europe and other places around the world. And it was all characterized by massive unemployment and debt, reaching 25% unemployment in the United States in 1933. And another condition of the Great Depression was that there were hardly any safety net programs for people who basically had lost jobs or were thrown into poverty. As a result, you had these extreme conditions that you read about in your readings. However, in the United States, it's going to last from 1929 to 1942, and it's going to mean economic and emotional devastation for the population. Some things that were going on during the Great Depression is that there was widespread terror and panic amongst the United States population. People weren't sure if the Depression was going to get worse or if it was ever going to get better. And this actually led to a lot of people who had lost savings or lost their jobs. Suicide rates are actually going to spike during the Great Depression, as certain people are going to see no way out and they're going to choose to take their own life. So this is how serious the conditions are going to be. It's going to be massive unemployment and money loss. There's also going to be that idea of want in the midst of plenty, where while people are hungry and starving, there's actually plenty of food, but nobody can afford to pay for it. The Great Depression is also going to challenge the idea of the American dream. And the American dream is an important concept in American history. And the American dream says that there is opportunity for success and upward mobility with hard work, merit, and good values. The American dream is the idea that life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability and achievement. And so this American dream is the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can be successful in this country. However, many Americans' dreams of prosperity are going to be shattered by the Great Depression. Many people lost money in the stock market crash. Many people during the 20s had taken on debt to buy things like houses and cars and other things. And when the Depression came, people did not have the money to pay for these things. As a result, you have repossessions and a spike in homelessness, and for many people, their dream of living the good life in the United States was shattered. And unemployment itself became emotionally devastating for many Americans during this time. Unemployment led to questions of self-worth by American citizens, and a belief that there was no opportunity, that the opportunities simply were not there, and that there was no way of achieving this American dream anymore. Here's a photo of two men on the streets of New York looking for a job. Another man looking for work during the Great Depression. Homeless man sleeping outside. And a breadline of well-dressed men probably recently thrown into the roles of the impoverished in the United States. This also led to the construction of what were known as Hoovervilles. And Hoovervilles were basically towns of shacks that people had built because they could not afford to live in houses or apartments. So they simply found whatever materials they could, and they built these little towns of shacks on the outskirts of cities. And these Hoovervilles demonstrate to us the large amount of poverty that was happening during the Great Depression. To make things worse for many Americans living in the western part of the country, the Great Depression also came at the same time as what became known as the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl was a result of a major drought. That means that no rain was happening. And the overfarming of the soil basically meaning that farmers had farmed too much and it had ruined the nutrients in the soil. As a result of this, the ground became dust. And when the winds picked up, there were massive dust storms that would cover large pieces of land, and millions of acres and hundreds of thousands of farms would be destroyed by these storms during the Dust Bowl. Here's a picture of one such dust storm with a car that is trying to outrun the storm. Here's a picture of a farm buried by one of these massive dust storms during the Dust Bowl. And so these farmers affected by the Dust Bowl were in very desperate situations. Their farms were destroyed, and so they couldn't grow any crops. And prices were extremely low for whatever crops were grown, leading to these farmers being unable to make enough money to pay the mortgages on their farm and not enough money to survive. And so this forced many farmers to leave their homes when their farms were foreclosed on. And so the goal for many of these farmers becomes simple survival. Here is a photo of a farming family that is basically forced now to live in a shack in one of those Hoovervilles. More pictures of children of farmers piling into the car, going to the town to town looking for work. And this brings up another theme during the Great Depression, that of isolation and loneliness. During the Great Depression, many families were forced to split up. Young hobos would have to make decisions to leave home because there simply wasn't enough food to feed them. And so they would ride around the country on railroad cars looking for work or a meal. And many people were forced to migrate from place to place, giving up their roots, their homes, their friends, their families, in order to just try to survive. And it's this idea of the isolation of survival. The idea that in this survival, many people simply felt like they were on their own. And so companionship among travelers and hobos becomes a very important theme during this Great Depression. But ultimately there's an overarching sense that nobody cares about these people. And so they're going to look for somebody or something that is going to look out for their interests. Here are some pictures of hobos climbing into railroad cars, a camp of hobos basically sharing a meal together outside, a young hobo trying to make his way onto a moving train, and you see one hobo helping the other get into this car in order to make it to the next town to look for work or food. There was also a large number of migrant workers during this time, workers who went farm to farm trying to find work in the fields. These migrant workers would literally walk from farm to farm, especially out in California, looking to see if anybody had any work. And these migrants had no land. They had no money in their pocket, and they really had no opportunities. So they were basically forced to wander around the United States on foot because they couldn't afford cars or to travel, and many of them ended up in California. However, the conditions they were subjected to were very exploitative. These desperate people were taken advantage of by being subjected to very poor working conditions and very low pay. But during this time, in order to survive, people had to accept being exploited in order to basically pay for their next meal. Here's a picture of some migrants working a field in California during the Great Depression. So this experience in the early years of the Great Depression are going to change Americans' attitude towards government. After the failure of people to basically cope with the Great Depression, more and more people begin to believe that the United States government should get involved in helping out people and solving the problems of the Great Depression. And as a result, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to win a landslide election in 1932, promising the American people a New Deal. So in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to win almost every state in the United States and a full 57% of the popular vote, ushering in a new era in American politics and arguably a new United States. When Franklin Roosevelt is elected, he is elected on a promise of a New Deal. So we're going to talk about that New Deal now. And just a quick review of conditions. You have high unemployment and poverty, hobos and migrants, the Dust Bowl, farmers are struggling, and the United States is in a very desperate position. So the questions we're going to look at here is, how did the Great Depression and the New Deal change the United States? And ultimately it is up to you to decide what the government's responsibility to provide for its citizens is, and what the government's role is in free market capitalism. But the Great Depression is going to see a changing American attitude towards government. On the left you have Herbert Hoover, on the right you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they're going to represent different ideas about the United States. Herbert Hoover believed that people were ultimately responsible for themselves, and that the government should not get involved in the lives of citizens. Franklin Roosevelt believed that the citizens of the United States needed a New Deal, an active government that would be involved in their lives and provide for Americans during times of need. So again, FDR wins in a big landslide, which he sees as basically the go-ahead to implement his New Deal. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the governor of New York. His legs had been crippled by polio, but FDR didn't let that stop him. And his political career rose, and then he ran for president promising a New Deal. And Roosevelt appealed to Americans because he had this confidence and optimism about him. And his campaign song was the song "Happy Days Are Here Again." So Americans, in their time of desperation, turned to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised them a better future and an optimistic outlook. Here's a picture of Roosevelt riding in a limo, a picture of Roosevelt with one of his granddaughters and his dog. But the New Deal was all based around the idea that something had to be done about the Great Depression. And so the New Deal said that they were going to try to do something, that the government should get involved. And the three main groups that are going to vote for Franklin Delano Roosevelt are going to become known as the New Deal Coalition. And this group that's going to vote for Franklin Roosevelt are going to be minorities, labor and union members, and liberal intellectuals. These three demographics of voters are going to be the primary Democratic voter base for a large portion of American history. So Roosevelt took office in early 1933, and he promised Americans that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so Roosevelt set out to implement his New Deal. And the New Deal had three goals: relief, recovery, and reform. And relief is all about providing aid to Americans who were struggling right then and there. Recovery was all about ending the Great Depression, and reform was about making sure that a Great Depression would not happen again. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his first 100 days in office, held 3 months of meetings with Congress in order to pass his New Deal legislation. He also declared a bank holiday, the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which meant that all banks had to close until they were allowed to reopen once they had gone through a government inspection and agreed to abide by Roosevelt's new rules for banks. And the goal of this was to restore people's confidence in the banks. The idea was that if Franklin Roosevelt said the banks were okay, Americans believed that the banks were okay. Here's a picture of Franklin Roosevelt behind the presidential desk, signing pieces of New Deal legislation into office. And while Roosevelt was passing his New Deal, he also took time to use a new media, radio. Radios had become popular in the 1920s, and so Franklin Roosevelt would go on the radio and deliver what were known as fireside chats. They were called fireside chats because the idea was that Franklin Roosevelt was sitting in his living room talking to the American people who were also sitting in their living rooms next to the fire. And these fireside chats were very popular, and he was able to get his message out to the American people directly. This also restored a lot of people's confidence, and they felt like somebody was looking out for them, and that somebody was Franklin Roosevelt. So the New Deal was really a big group of government programs meant to provide relief, recovery, and reform to Americans during this time. One of these programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, and this was basically a group of jobs that were created for young men in national parks. And these men would work planting trees, working on national parks, building bridges, and it gave unemployed young men who might otherwise be hobos going all around the country riding the trains a chance to work, eat healthy, and also have pride in that day's work. A big important thing about the New Deal was restoring people's pride in a hard day's work. And for these young men, for some of them, it was the first time that they had had an opportunity to work and provide for themselves, and they could also send money home to their families. Here's a picture of some young men working for the Civilian Conservation Corps. A poster of promoting the Civilian Conservation Corps. Another program that went into being was the Tennessee Valley Authority, and this was an organization that provided utilities such as running water and electricity to areas in Appalachia, highlighted in yellow on the map, that were particularly hit hard by the conditions of the Great Depression. And so this was meant to provide some relief to those people hit hardest. There were also programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA, which actually paid farmers not to grow crops and not to have livestock. The idea is that they were trying to control prices by controlling supply. The idea being that you could, by lowering supply, increase the price of goods and provide relief to farmers. The National Industrial Recovery Act created the National Recovery Administration. This was an organization of businesses that basically would be controlled by the United States government. And the NRA encouraged businesses to set a minimum wage that they would pay their workers. It encouraged them to fix the prices of goods so that Americans could afford them, and it also meant that the government would have a lot of regulation, a lot of control and rule setting over businesses. And the NRA was not a required thing. However, many people chose to abide by the rules of the NRA and place the Blue Eagle poster basically saying that this business cooperated with the federal government. The idea here was that businesses that didn't have the NRA, people would be less likely to shop at them than businesses that did. So the government tried to give businesses an incentive in terms of public opinion to cooperate with the New Deal. There were also programs like the Works Progress Administration. And this poster basically gives the idea of the Works Progress Administration was that work promotes confidence. And what the WPA did was it was a stimulus package that basically created a bunch of new jobs by constructing public works, like roads, dams, bridges, and also public buildings like hospitals, new schools, new parks, new airports. And the WPA even provided work to artists who paid artists to paint murals, write plays, actors to act in them, create art, and other things like that. So the WPA was all about government spending to create jobs. So here's a picture of a WPA project, widening a road. We still have these types of projects today. A new bridge that went in, as well as a new swimming pool. Building dams and canals. Painting murals were a part of the WPA. Some of these murals in public buildings are still available. You can still see them. They haven't gone away in the last 80 years. Also, the WPA would put on plays for people. The idea being provide cheap entertainment to people who were going through the Great Depression, as well as put out-of-work actors and actresses and playwrights back to work. There was also the Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act, and this was the first time in American history that the United States government recognized the right of employees to join unions and collectively bargain. So if you know anybody who's in a union, you can thank the National Labor Relations Act that was passed as part of the New Deal. The minimum wage was also established during the Great Depression by the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, was also put into place during the New Deal, which protected deposits up to $250,000. And the FDIC supervises banks to try to make sure that the bad banking structure and the collapse of the banks that happened during the Great Depression would never happen again. Social Security, the idea of having a safety net and a pension plan for American citizens, is a new idea and is put into place during the New Deal. Social Security is an example of a New Deal program that's still around today. And this is the idea of social insurance. It includes federal old age retirement, basically for people who reach a certain age and then can collect retirement benefits. This also includes unemployment insurance, that if you lose your job, you can get a little bit of assistance to help you until you find a new one. And this also provides aid to families who have children. So all of these social insurance programs were all a part of Social Security, which was established during the Great Depression. And it's paid for by a payroll tax on current workers. So if you work, money is taken out of every paycheck to pay for Social Security. The Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, basically is put into place to regulate and enforce laws dealing with stock markets and businesses. These people basically are there to try to prevent fraud and abuses and speculation that led to the stock market crash of 1929. The SEC is still around today and still plays a prominent role in Americans' economic system. But not everybody liked the New Deal, and the New Deal remains controversial to this day. And one of the big questions was, is the New Deal constitutional, or did these programs actually violate United States law? And the reality is that some of these programs actually did violate United States law and were illegal. For example, the National Industrial Recovery Act was declared unconstitutional because it was the government playing too big of a role and violating its limited government role in business. Franklin Delano Roosevelt also tried to add members to the Supreme Court who agreed with him politically when Supreme Court justices started declaring some of his programs to be illegal. This was known as court packing and was very controversial because people thought that Franklin Roosevelt was trying to take too much power. They thought that he was acting like he was the king of democracy and wasn't abiding by the rules of the country. There was also the concern, and still to this day, that this idea of basically the government providing all of these benefits to people is socialism. So there is a debate to be had, and critics basically would criticize the New Deal, saying that it took money from some people in order to provide money for other people. And so it remains controversial till today. The New Deal also greatly expanded government size and government power in a way that the government had not been before. And big government spending, especially deficit spending, is a controversial issue that remains a part of our political discussion today. Here's a political cartoon where basically FDR is trying to shoot down one of his critics, the Lone Eagle, on the right side of the political cartoon, who was Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh's nickname was the Lone Eagle, and here's a picture of Roosevelt trying to shoot down his opponents. Here's a political cartoon showing FDR as the king of democracy, where many people thought that FDR was simply ignoring and canceling the Constitution and doing whatever he wanted. Here is another picture of Franklin Roosevelt where he is sowing billions of dollars hoping that something would grow. Again, very critical of Roosevelt spending all this money, and people said it didn't solve the problem. Another picture of Roosevelt with all of his children, all of his programs, and ring around a Roosevelt, pockets full of dough. So, does the New Deal succeed? Was it a successful idea? And in order to look at was it successful, we can look at each goal. The New Deal was successful in providing relief to Americans. It provided temporary assistance, work for people in the WPA and the CCC and the bank holiday, and the New Deal did a long way to kind of alleviating some of the desperate conditions of the Great Depression. But it fails at recovery. The New Deal does not succeed in ending the Great Depression. And in fact, all of these programs don't result in a second recession that takes place in the late 1930s. So the New Deal fails to end the Great Depression. And reform is still controversial. It's still really disputed whether or not programs like the SEC, the FDIC, and Social Security were good at the time, and if they're still good today, or if they have any real impact. People point to the crash of 2008 to basically say that, well, in 2008, some people say that it didn't turn into a Great Depression because of these programs, and others will point to these programs and say that they failed to prevent another large economic downturn. So So the New Deal remains controversial until today, and no one is really quite agreeing on whether or not it was a successful program. But the New Deal did fundamentally change the government's role in the United States forever. After the New Deal, Americans began to expect the government to be involved in the economy and promote high employment and prosperity. Before that, there wasn't really a sense that it was the government's responsibility. Another change in the government's role is that nowadays we believe that the government should help people in need. But this idea was controversial in the 1930s, and it's controversial in today's world. And the question is, are people responsible for themselves, or should the government help people who are in need while they are in their time of desperation? And ultimately, the federal government will grow much larger and will have much more power as a result of these New Deal programs. American attitudes are also going to change. Before the Great Depression, there was an idea called social Darwinism, where kind of everybody was responsible for themselves, and if you were in poverty, it was your own fault. But the widespread effects of the Great Depression call into question this idea that circumstances do play a large part in poverty becomes the prevailing attitude. There's also a move towards more social responsibility in government activism. The idea that there should be a minimum standard of living for American citizens and that the government should provide welfare in order to take care of citizens who are in need. So, again, we're back to the question, is the New Deal a success or a failure? And the New Deal did not end the Great Depression, but for a lot of people, the New Deal provided some relief, and it did create a new sense of optimism and confidence. And the New Deal also gave a lot of people a chance to be working again and to feel pride in that work. So, critics will say the deficit spending and the expansion of government fail to end the New Deal, and others will say that its successes are going to outweigh its failures. But one thing is for certain, the end of the Great Depression does not come until the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the United States into World War II.